billboards were a nice surprise this morning. That's definitely one to show the kids. And yes, I was here about 6 months ago for the last event in February. Fantastic event to be at. You know, I came in to do a talk and I ended up stopping for about 6 hours chatting to people. And what amazed me was the interest, the engagement, and the fabulous sort of like-minded people. So I guess at an event like Sustainability Live, we've all got the same priorities and things we want to talk about. So it's great to be back. And actually, I want to kind of pick up on where I left off the last time, which was this concept of electricity 4.0. And the fastest route that we have to get to net zero. So Schneider, you had a little bit of a mention there about Schneider, the obligatory thing. So we are a global organization employing around 150,000 people. We're in about 100 countries around the world, and everybody that works for this company is passionate about sustainability and helping mitigate climate change. Bit about us. So this is what we do. You know, our purpose is to help people make the most of their energy. We are specialists in energy management and automation. Really, our goal is to be the digital partner for sustainability and efficiency for our customers. So what justifies us to be here talking to you about these things? Well, as Scott just mentioned, we were super proud last year to be recognized by Corporate Knights as the world's most sustainable corporation. And sustainability really is the core of everything we do. So this wasn't by luck, it was by years and years of hard work. On two sides. One is what we're doing ourselves in our own ecosystem, and one is what we're doing to be this digital partner for our customers. So very quickly on our side, very robust plan of how we're going to decarbonize our business. By 2025, we'll be carbon neutral. By 2030, we'll be net zero or very close to it. And actions there to get there include fully electric fleet of vehicles all around the world. We'll have 100 net zero sites. We'll have entirely renewable energy across the business. And then from 2040 to 2050, we're looking at how we can make sure that goes across the entire supply chain. So I don't know how many of you realize and are familiar with the fact that when you look at your emissions, quite a lot of the time, your scope 1 and 2 that you can control is actually the smallest part of it. And the biggest part is upstream in the suppliers. So as a company that specializes in sustainability, it's our goal and our mission to take our partners and our suppliers on that journey with us. So let's turn to what we're doing for customers, and I'll just put up one stat for now, and that is that by 2025, we will have helped our customers save or avoid 800 million tons of CO2. And I know sometimes it's hard to quantify, so I thought I'll put a couple of things up. The first is that is equivalent to more than double the total carbon emissions from the UK annually. And I know sometimes people equate it to taking cars off the roads and things like that, so I thought it would be quite fun to say that's about the same as taking a passenger vehicle and driving it to the moon and back 4 million times. So it's quite a lot of carbon that we're helping our customers to save and to avoid. Now, being at an event called Sustainability Live, I guess I'm pushing on an open door here when we all realize that climate change really is the biggest challenge of our generation. And we're unfortunately seeing its impacts ravaging our world more and more frequently. If we look back just at this year, we look to North America, we can see extreme heat events. We can see flooding that was described as a once-in-a-thousand-year event in America. If we look to Europe, we're seeing the worst drought in 500 years. We're seeing forest fires across Europe. Of course, here in the UK, we saw our hottest ever temperatures. And we're seeing the glaciers melting faster than ever before in Europe. And when we look across to Asia, in China, the Yangtze River was drying up. China breaking all records for summer heat waves. We're seeing landslides. We're seeing flooding from India to Bangladesh to the terrible scenes that we see now, of course, in Pakistan with a third of the country underwater. So I think we all know it's undeniable that we need to be taking faster action to try and put the brakes on these things. So like any problem, I think the simplest way that we need to tackle it is to simplify the challenge itself. So I'll start with the same statement I started with last time, that is climate change is really about energy. And why is that? That's because more than 80% of the world's carbon emissions come from either the production or the consumption of energy. Now, today around 80% of that energy comes from fossil fuels. And I think we're all kind of aware that we need to move to cleaner sources of energy. But another fact to consider there on the right is that today around 60% of energy is either lost or wasted. So there's a huge opportunity to drive more efficiency in the way that we use our energy today, and perhaps never more critical than right now in the midst of an energy crisis and soaring energy prices. So there's some good news. The good news I would start with is that people are starting to accelerate their commitments, whether that's governments or whether that's companies. On the government side, off the back of COP26, we saw 74 countries signing up for net zero pledges. And that accounts for about 89% of the world's carbon. So great that we're seeing these pledges being made. We're seeing big numbers being bandied about around green stimulus plans and investment that's being put into actions that are going to mitigate climate change. And on the corporate side, we're seeing increasingly more and more companies signing up for science-based targets, for commitments to lower their emissions and to be more sustainable. And in fact, we're seeing pretty much a doubling year on year of companies that are making these commitments. But really, it's still not fast enough. Why is it not fast enough? Because at the moment, with the pledges that we see around the world today, we are on target by the end of this decade, by when we need to halve emissions to be on track for net zero by 2050. We need to be halving our emissions. And today, the commitments that are in place would account for about 4 gigatons of CO2 to be saved annually. That puts us on a pathway for about 2.4 degree climate change by the end of this century. To be on track for 1.5, we need to be saving somewhere between 10 and 15 gigatons of CO2 per year. We need to move a lot faster. And like I mentioned, energy plays a massive part of this. And there are really two sides to it. The biggest part at the top is energy supply decarbonisation. I think we all know the direction. We're going to make energy cleaner. But then there's the demand side of this to take into account as well. You know, what do we use today that's driven by fossil fuels, that can be converted, that can be electrified? This is process electrification. The best example that everyone can relate to is vehicles, transitioning to electric vehicles, or electric heating, or things that can be moving away from our dependence on fossil fuels. And about a quarter of the savings are going to come from demand optimization, where I mentioned already there's a huge amount of energy waste today. So, commitments are one thing. I'm saying today, by the end of last year really, a small percentage of Fortune 500 companies were actually delivering on their commitments that they'd made. Anybody want to hazard a guess what that percentage might be? Silence. It's 8%. Only 8% of companies were delivering on the targets that they'd made. So something's going wrong. We're seeing an acceleration in commitments, which is great. That acceleration needs to continue, but we also need to make sure people are following through and delivering on this. So at Schneider, we have a research institute, we have a science center, and these are just some of the most recent ones that we've done. On the left there, you can see our back to 2050 scenarios, which outlines our strategic plan of how we achieve net zero by 2050. In the middle, you'll see one we've just done as well called our Energy Volatility Data Book. But the one I want to focus on today is the one that we're actually building right now. So I'm kind of going to give you a sneak preview of some of the research that we've just done and how we're starting to try and understand some of the challenges. So we spoke to more than 500 CXOs from Fortune 500 companies, and we asked them about their plans to be more sustainable as a business and their commitments. And we asked them about their challenges, and we asked them about what they were focusing on. So top implementation challenges, I guess lots of people in the room and online will be familiar with these as well. There's stakeholder alignment, getting everybody on the journey with us. There's the budget. How do we pay for this stuff? Well, actually, you know, a lot of this is self-funding because there's a very fast return on investment. The technology, how do we find the technology? You know, and this is a big part of it. Are we failing to deliver because we're making commitments and then we don't know how to deliver them? We need the technology, we need the workforce skills. Government and regulation challenges. How do we make sure that we're compliant? How do we collect data? And really, to do this properly, we need to be collecting data real time. How do we integrate sustainability into the strategic goals of the business? And how do we look at our supply chain and partners? Like I mentioned, they're a big part of the full emissions journey end to end when you look at that. So there's some of the key challenges that we thought that people were facing. So we looked at the responses and we categorized the companies we spoke to into leaders and laggards. So we took the top 20% in terms of how robust their plans were and the bottom 20%. And we saw that actually there's some significant differences. First, from the amount of commitment they're making financially. So the leaders were investing more than double the laggards in the Fortune 500s. In terms of defining their ambition, the laggards are still only around 33% in terms of understanding what their ambition is and what they want to achieve, versus the leaders at more than double that. And exploring innovation And this is where I think this is a key part of it. It's great to set targets, but we need to understand how are we going to deliver on those targets? What's the technology? What do we need to put in place to drive that? And then just going one step deeper, we put up some categories and said which of these feature in your plans for the future? Which of these are priorities for you? And you'll see on the right there is that solution that I mentioned for the future is how do we get to a net zero world? And half of it comes from decarbonisation of energy, and the other half comes from electrifying and optimising our usage. So perhaps the most shocking for me was the number one category on there that people are prioritising is messaging. It's talking about it rather than actually doing it. Now, messaging is important once you've done everything else. You need to take all your stakeholders on the journey, your employees, your customers, everybody. But the first priority is plan the actions that are going to actually make the difference. So I want to look at just a couple of those categories. I've picked some from the top, the middle, and the bottom. And at the top, we can see, this is great, renewable energy procurement. That's a quick win, and that helps solve this big part of the pie, the top. We're moving to cleaner energy sources. If we come down to the middle, we're looking at, I'm going to have to look on this one because that's too small, supply chain decarbonisation. This is great, again, important because it's a big piece of the puzzle. It's the Scope 3 emissions. Rising, and I mentioned, by the way, that we're working with our partners on this. So we have our top 1,000 suppliers at Schneider Electric are all part of a program with us where they will be halving their emissions by 2025 as well. Rising energy costs, reducing energy use, so energy optimization. I mean, this is so critical right now with what we're going through, the energy shortages and energy prices. This is a no-brainer. This needs to be a priority for everyone, whether this is business or whether this is us in our homes. We can all use less energy. And then the next one, distributed energy resources. So this is about going from what we think of a traditional grid, which was we produce energy in large quantities in power stations, we distribute it over large distances to points of consumption that then use it. First, we need to make those points of consumption more frugal, so they require less energy, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. But we also need to look at rethinking how we produce that energy as well. So the distributed energy is about more microgrids. Everything from solar panels on our roofs to heat pumps to companies that are putting huge solar panels on the tops of their roofs and wind turbines, to more localized power grids as well, and that makes the energy infrastructure more robust as well. It's closer to points of consumption, it doesn't need to travel as far, there are fewer losses in transmission. And of course this all feeds in to contribute to our energy requirements for the future. But then most worryingly for me is right down at the bottom. Here you see the two categories very closely linked, driving electrification and electric vehicles and e-mobility. They are both about turning things on the consumption side, on the demand side, from things that require fossil fuels to things that can run on energy. And the reason that's important is because electricity can be decarbonised. Yes, today we know we can make it from renewables, and actually there's a share. Some comes from fossil fuels, some comes from nuclear, biofuels. But it's the best vector for decarbonisation because we can decarbonise electricity over time. So we need things that can run on that vector for decarbonisation. And that's the smallest priority for businesses at the moment, yet it's 30% of the solution of how we'll get to a net zero world. So what should companies be doing? Well, we advocate for a very simple three-step process, and that is strategize, digitize, decarbonize. And if everybody does this, we're perfectly capable of staying on track for our 1.5 degree scenario. So strategize is upfront, it's having a plan. But to do this, you need to understand your baselines. You can't measure and control what you can't see. So you need measures put in place to understand what is that baseline. Then you can create your roadmap. Then you can create a structured program and governance to understand how you're going to perform on that. And then you can communicate your commitment. Once you know what it is that you're going to do and how you're going to do that. The next step, digitizing. There are two elements to digital, I would say. There's upfront digitization for visualization, to understand better how we're using things so we can optimize it. And then there's a part in decarbonization, which is using technology to use it more efficiently. But in the digitized stage here, we're talking about the ability to really understand and monitor in real time how we're consuming energy. Because remember, it's 80% of the challenge of carbon emissions. When we monitor it, we can understand where we can save it. We can't understand what savings can be made if we can't see how we're using it. And then we can report, and then we can start benchmarking progress. We can see how we're doing against those targets that we've set. And lastly, it's about decarbonizing. Once we've done those first steps, then it's electrifying operations, which I mentioned. Critical that we move to things that can be decarbonised. We can reduce our energy use by using digital technologies and software to deploy that energy more efficiently. We can do that in our homes, we can do that in our places of work, and it's not about going with less, it's about avoiding waste. It's about being able to use that energy more efficiently. We can then replace energy sources, so this is about moving to cleaner sources of energy coming in, whether that's from our own energy production as prosumers, or whether that's coming in from the grid. And then we can engage with the value chain and say, right, we have our own robust plan now, how do we replicate this with the partners and people that we work with? So that's what we should be doing. I just want to take a step back then and say, so how did we get into the mess that we're in today? And this is what a little bit that I talked about last time I was here. And it's this concept of electricity 4.0. So really, since the dawn of humanity, we have been burning things to fuel our evolution. We've been living in an age of fire. And really, the biggest impacts on carbon have happened in the last couple of 100 years. So the reason I'm starting here around 1750 is because it was the first industrial revolution. Now, everybody's heard of industrial revolutions, right? Has anybody heard of electrical revolutions? Because actually, every time there's been an industrial revolution, it's been powered, and we've simultaneously seen revolutions in electricity. From the early days of steam power and mobility with Industry 1.0 to the early pioneers of electricity, that's Volta and Faraday, to skipping forward about 100 years, we'd learned to scale that technology on a massive scale. So Industry 2.0 was marked up by mass manufacturing, mass deployment of things. And at the same time, the second electrical revolution was marked by the introduction of the first power stations, coincided around the same time. And guess what? This is where we start to see the increase of human-induced CO2 emissions. It's where we're starting to really scale things up and really scale up our demand for energy. Now, if we jump forward about another 100 years to middle of last century, the third industrial revolution came about with the development of silicon. So silicon facilitating automation for industry. But that silicon also brought about digital technologies, which helped us think differently about electricity. And it was also even the birth of the first solar cells, very early days, but solar cells which gave birth to some of the renewable technologies that we see today. And that brings us right up to today, where you see here what the carbon curve has been, and we're at the peak of that carbon curve now. And you see how steeply that drops to be net zero by 2050, and actually halving of our emissions by the end of this decade. And we think that this is the thing that's going to do it, or play a very large part of it. And it's the convergence of electric and digital at scale. Because like I said, electric allows us to decarbonize, and digital makes us use energy smarter. So that's it. Think of electricity 4.0 really as a fuel. It's a new electric world. It's the fuel for a more sustainable and more resilient world. Electric makes energy green. It is the most efficient energy, particularly when we use renewables. And it's the best vector for decarbonisation, because even if it's partly fueled from fossil fuels now, that production is increasingly going to come from renewables. You can decarbonise it. We can't decarbonise fossil. And digital builds a smart future. So remember, 60% of energy today is lost or wasted. So this gives us an opportunity to use that energy more efficiently, to understand how we're using it, and to save it, and to deploy it, and not to go with less, just to cut out the waste. So I mentioned electricity is the most efficient form of energy. A lot of data on this screen, I know, but I'm just going to explain a few things. At the top, you see what everybody's familiar with and how we've fueled our evolution in the past through fossil fuels. And you see the efficiency measures there from a unit of energy of its potential to actually what that converts to as useful energy at the end. We can see that oil's incredibly inefficient, largely because by the time it's been converted to petrol or diesel and put in our cars aren't very efficient at turning that into energy. So we see huge energy efficiency drop-offs for oil. For coal, it's about 50% of its potential that actually gets used as energy, but it's terribly polluting, so of course we don't want to use that. Gas is about 70% efficient. So as a transition fuel, while we're still dependent on fossil fuels until we can get more renewables, it's the better solution, I would say, to use of what we have. But of course, we want to be moving away from fossil and moving into electricity, because all of these elements will eventually close up on the things that are cleaner and are not creating CO2 emissions. And when you look at it, A lot of electricity generation comes through thermal processes, and that means losses. Where if you look at renewable technologies like wind and like solar, it's 100% efficient. The only losses you see are in the transmission of that energy to the point of consumption. And because increasingly these renewables are located closer on our roofs, microgrids, it means that energy is traveling less distance. So we see even more efficiency gains coming from that proximity. So renewable energy is obviously clean. We can see here it's incredibly efficient. What about pricing? Well, I created this, or we did this research before really the energy crisis hit and the prices went crazy. So this was before then, and this was looking at if we were to create new energy production, what would be the cheapest form of energy if we wanted to open a new power plant, let's say. And you can see that already more than 2/3 of the world now have renewables, either wind or solar, as the cheapest form of energy if they want to create new. Now add that to what we're facing today with the energy crisis, and that's amplified even further. So, we don't have some data on some countries, but you can see there are very few parts of the world now where we're still seeing fossil fuel as the cheapest source of energy. So it's clean, it's efficient, and it's increasingly cheaper. So what if we marry then electricity with digital? Like I said, electric and digital is the key to solving emissions crisis. The next step is for us to understand how do we accelerate it? Where do we need to put our attention? And our attention really can be put into just 3 sectors. It's buildings, it's where we live, where we work, where we go for our entertainment. We spend a huge amount of time in buildings. It's our industries, which can be increasingly electrified, and it's transport that can be increasingly electrified. So I'm going to focus just now, in the interest of time, on the first one, the buildings. It's the biggest piece of the puzzle. And if we consider buildings from the design phase through to the build phase, through to the operate and maintain phase that we're most used to of being in these buildings, using these buildings. Well, up front, the design phase, 30% of construction work today is rework. That's the cost. 30% of the cost comes from doing things again because they weren't quite right. So this means massive efficiencies available in the design phase. The next part is the build phase. Massive 90% of projects overrun in terms of time. So at the build phase, huge opportunity to drive some more efficiency in there. And at the operate and maintain stage, that being in the buildings, being occupiers, we spend 90% of our time indoors, at home, at work, at the cinema, at the restaurant, wherever it is, 90% of our time. So we need to make sure that these buildings are as efficient as they can be. Are they efficient? Well, let's look at the construction part of it, the design and the build phase. How's it performing and how's it stacking up against other industries? This is efficiency gains in the last 60 years. And you can see we need to do a bit of work on construction, especially considering buildings is the biggest contributor to emissions. Agriculture doing great, wholesale and retail, manufacturing. Overall, there's a steady upward curve, but we see some real challenges with efficiency in construction. So we need to focus, and I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but on the design phase, the build phase, and the operate and maintain phase. And this is where digital comes in. Particularly in the design and build phase, around the energy side of it, it's about getting it right up front. That design phase. Today there's inefficiency, there are challenges around compliance with new efficiency regulations. We're in transition to a new landscape that's going to incorporate EVs and microgrids, which is challenging because it's all very new to people. The benefits we're going to get is a collaborative environment and these seamless workflows. So this is where you can see designs, you can evaluate AI designs of these options. On the build phase, low margins, lots of overruns, lots of rework and waste. What we need is connected teams, connected processes, more data, better project planning, costing, construction, monitoring. And using software like this typically can bring about a 20% savings on the lifespan. And lastly, the operate and maintain phase. So here it's about software to understand how it's being used, but also digital technology to deploy that energy more efficiently so that we can understand what is the actual cost versus the benchmarks, versus what we expected. How do we measure our sustainability metrics? So, if we do all of these things, we go from buildings today, which are mainly fossil fueled. They depend on fossil fuel-driven energy coming into that building. Their traditional grid dependency, like we said about we create it, we distribute it, and those buildings consume it. There's very little bi-directional energy flow in there. They're low electrification. They're powered by fossil fuels. They have devices and things that need fossil fuels. And they're very manually controlled. And manual, a lot of the time, means waste. We can automate to avoid that waste. Buildings of the future are going to be much more green electricity, much more self-generation, more microgrids, this bi-directional concept, more electrification of use, more automation and digital technology to drive savings. And those savings are, here you see quite a ranging scale, but 20 to 35% is the average. This is what we can achieve quite easy. 20 to 35% of energy savings. Can be up to 100% depending on how much we put in terms of renewables. Typically for carbon abatement, 20 to 30%, but can be up to 100%. But the big thing on this is the ROI is incredibly quick, especially at times of energy crisis and high energy prices. But not only is the ROI quick, the impact on sustainability credentials is immediate. So I'm going to close out with just a couple of very quick examples to show that we walk the talk. This is what we do ourselves. This is a building that we opened in France about a year ago, recognized as one of the most sustainable buildings in the world. It uses 1/10 of the energy of an average European building. So remember, we start on the demand side. We make buildings and points of consumption as frugal as they can be so they require less energy. That means that by putting solar panels and wind turbines on the roof, it's entirely energy autonomous, which is increasingly important for businesses because we don't want fluctuations of energy prices affecting the business. Same for governments, making their own energy so that they're not dependent on buying things in the ground from other countries. So it's entirely self-sufficient. Not only that, but it has batteries so that it can store energy. And when those batteries get full, it puts that energy back into the district and shares that energy with neighboring buildings. So that's a new building. And I think it's very easy to focus on new buildings and look at what can be done with new technology. But if we've got to be net zero by 2050, we need to consider that 80% of the buildings that will exist already exist today. So we need to take our existing buildings on this journey as well. And here's an example of our head office building for Japan and East Asia, built in the 1990s, saving 122,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year, and is now a carbon neutral building despite being 30 years old. So it can be done. And we think, just to close off, that what might net zero actually look like in 2050? Well, on the supply side, grids of the future, increasingly coming from renewables, buildings of the future with heat pumps and solar on every roof and 100% digital to drive efficiency, infrastructure of the future where we see most of the vehicles on the road to be clean, non-polluting vehicles. We expect a doubling of rail travel powered by electricity, a halving of air travel. And on the industry side, huge recycling rates, and potentially around about 50% electrification. And where electrification can't work, then potentially some hydrogen to be used in there as well. So that's it. I think I'm just about on time. If you want to connect in the middle there, that's how you can get on a Strategize, Digitize, Decarbonize journey. On the right, I'd be delighted to connect and continue discussions with anybody. And on the left, you've got a link to our vision of how we get to 2050. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Steve. If there are any questions from the floor, if you just want to throw your hand up quickly, and we will try and get a mic over to you. Now, if anyone does have questions, if anyone else has any questions, we're a little bit running over time, but I'm sure Steve will be more than happy to answer any of those questions. And you'll be here for a while?
I'm sticking around, yeah.
Steve's going to be around, so if you want to ask him any questions face-to-face, please do that. And anyone who sent in questions via the app, we'll try and make sure Steve can answer those as well.
Thank you.
But to start with, if you just say your name and where you're from, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm Laura McMullen. I'm a freelance consultant at present.
Hi.
Wondering where nuclear sits on that, because I didn't see it mentioned in terms of efficiency or as part of the solution.
Yeah. So when I talked about bidirectional grids of the future, the first thing is we need to make our energy from clean sources in future. Now, my preference is wherever possible is that we go for renewables. It's the safest and the most efficient option that we have. But of course, it's going to take time to get there. And in getting there, we're always still going to need to have a base load. The sun doesn't always shine. The wind doesn't always blow and spin our wind turbines for us. So I think we'll get to a point where this bidirectional is, for example, you've got an electric vehicle parked in your car. It's a 75 kilowatt battery. Your house uses 8 to 10 kilowatts a day. You've got a huge storage of energy there that can be coming from renewable energy and can be put back into the grid when needed. But it's going to take time for us to get there. And I think, in that time as well, we're always going to need base loads of energy. And this isn't necessarily one size fits all. If you look at different parts of the world, you look at Singapore, for example, no capacity to be energy autonomous because they have no wind and they've got a very small amount of space. They can put solar on the rooftops, but they're never going to generate enough. So they can look at solutions like pipelines that are going to bring in renewable energy from Australia or neighboring countries, or I know that they're looking at putting a small nuclear reactor on a local island, for example, that can generate for them as well. So absolutely, it figures, yeah.
Okay, thanks for your question. We are going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But another great session. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, pleasure to be back. Thank you.